This morning, we're continuing in this really short sermon series through these encounters with Jesus in chapter 20 of the Gospel of John. And these encounters are the ways in which Jesus showed up to people after the crucifixion and those 3 days and then being raised from the dead. This morning, we come to the third one, the third encounter between Jesus and Thomas. Won't you listen to the word of the Lord from John chapter 20, verses 24 through 31. But Thomas, who was called the twin, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands, unless I put my finger in the mark of those nails and my hand in his side, I will not believe." Then, a week later, the disciples were again in the house, and Thomas was with them. The doors were shut, but Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it in my side. Do not doubt, but believe." Thomas answered him, "My Lord, my God." And then Jesus said to him, "Have you believed because you now recognize me? But blessed are those who have not and yet have come to believe." Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples. They're not written in this book, but these are written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Second grade. 8 years old, and it was a rough year for me. Prior to second grade, my classroom experiences had been fairly active, with teachers using stations and activities a good portion of the day, interspersed with 3 different recesses. Report card comments on my kindergarten and first grade report cards said things like, "Beth is creative. She moves well through learning stations. She completes tasks. She's very curious and asks lots of questions," which surprises no one. However, second grade brought with it 3 changes. The first, only 2 recess periods each day. The second, a teacher with a teaching style that relied mostly on stationary work, sitting at desks and listening to lessons. And third, a personalized behavior chart taped right to the top of that desk to hold all the tally marks I accumulated every time I wasn't sitting pockets on my chair and feet on the floor and hands on my desk. A reminder every day that I failed at listening. I didn't really figure out until graduate school in my 20s that my body needs to move to focus, that I need to touch things to learn. And that's the way my brain and my body were designed. But back in second grade, my teacher was bound and determined to break me of that need for movement and touch. If it was the very last thing she did. I know this because she actually told me so. And as a result of her goal that year, I probably spent slightly more time sitting outside the principal's office than I did in my desk. Because, truth be told, my brain was designed to move and touch things. And 9 months of tally marks and sitting outside the principal's office wasn't going to somehow rewire the way in which my brain was made to function and understand. My second grade teacher, I think, she could have probably benefited from another class or 2 on learning style theory. God has planned and purposed our brains quite uniquely to understand and absorb information in different ways, Depending on which learning theorist you reference, there are anywhere between 3 and 20 different categories of learning styles. Some people's brains understand the world best by listening. Lectures and audible books and podcasts are so beneficial. Still others understand by seeing. Slides and presentations alongside those lectures, pictures and movies are helpful. And then there's little 8-year-old Beth, who thrived with tactile and experience-based learning that focused on sorting and creating and putting together and taking apart and liked to ask lots of questions. My second grade teacher didn't recognize these unique brain differences in her students. There were 2 categories in her classroom, students and teacher. And if you were a student in her classroom, you were going to learn and understand things her way, or you weren't going to learn and understand them at all. She may not have been able to break me of my need for movement and touch, but she was able to make me feel as if I was somehow wrong for being me, that it was unacceptable to be who I was. And it's that something that she taught me about this experience when I was 8 that gives me a unique lens for reading the resurrection encounters with Jesus, found in John chapter 20. You may remember the first one. 2 weeks ago, we peeked in on Mary Magdalene as she visited the empty tomb of Jesus. In a case of mistaken identity, Mary, a disciple who did not yet believe that Jesus had risen from the dead, heard the risen Jesus speak her name, and she immediately recognized him. Her doubt and confusion turned to belief and understanding. Then, after hearing Jesus and recognizing him, Mary went and told the other disciples about the risen Jesus. And then last week, we joined that group of fearful disciples who had heard her, yet not quite believed, so they remained fearful behind locked doors in a safe house. And in the case of cowardice, the disciples did not believe that Jesus had risen from the dead until he showed up, and they saw the nail marks in Jesus' hands and sides. Then, at the seeing, they recognized Jesus. Their doubt and confusion turned to belief and understanding. This week, we find ourselves with Thomas in the midst of that third encounter with the risen Jesus, an encounter that begins, like all the others, with confusion and doubt. The first part of this encounter, it takes place shortly after last week's. Jesus had entered and exited the room by this time and behind that locked door, but Thomas arrived to the scene. And when Thomas arrived, the disciples passionately recounted the events, each trying to be heard over the other, I imagine. Jesus is alive. We have seen him. He was here. We have seen the Lord. After they quieted down, I'm sure to let their good news sink in a bit, they stepped back and waited for Thomas' reply. But Thomas, completely unfazed and unconvinced, said, "Unless I see the marks for myself, no, unless I touch the holes in his hands and his side myself, I will not believe." Unless I touch the holes in his hands and his side for myself, I will not believe. Mary needed to hear. The fearful disciples locked away needed to see. And Thomas needed to touch. In our modern day context, I have a hunch that Thomas would be one of those tactile, experiential learners, learning best by touching and demonstrating and experiencing. He couldn't just hear about Jesus. He couldn't just see Jesus. He needed to experience Jesus. So, when the little Tommies and Beths sit in desks in carefully crafted PowerPoint presentations and smartboard shows about Jesus and listen to seemingly endless lectures about Jesus, they could do that all day, and chances are they will not get what people are trying to tell them about Jesus. They'll still be confused, doubting what they've heard with their ears and seen with their eyes until they experience something of Jesus. And Thomas, so smartly, names what he needs. Unless I touch the holes in the hands and his side for myself, I will not believe. Then, the story, it fast forwards for us a bit, 1 week to be exact. And the disciples, including Thomas this time, are gathered together in the house. And this is a week later. Can you imagine? So Thomas, doubting and confused, lived among these enthusiastic believers for an entire week. This is akin to that time you came home from the most amazing Christian camp or retreat or mission trip or insert whatever mountaintop spiritual experience you've had, and you told your best friend, and your best friend stared at you like you had lost your mind. That's Thomas and the disciples. So, of course, the believing disciples were persistent and relentless, I imagine, in that week, probably taken aback that Thomas wasn't won over by their eyewitness account. He wouldn't drink the Kool-Aid. He wouldn't pray the prayer. He wouldn't come forward for the altar call. Their own resistance to belief in Mary's story, only a short time ago, completely forgotten. In a case of déjà vu, one that replicates the story before, Jesus comes into the locked room and stands among them with a familiar greeting. Peace be with you. And then he speaks directly to Thomas, and he knows exactly what Thomas needs. It's not just hearing, and it's not just seeing. Jesus says something like, all right, Thomas, put your finger here. Touch my hands and my side, and do not doubt, but believe. The original Greek language, it leads us to believe that Jesus was not reprimanding or condemning Thomas. There were no tally marks on his desk. Rather, Jesus, in a very matter-of-fact appeal, offers what is needed for Thomas to believe, just as he did for Mary and just as he did for the disciples in the locked house. And it is at this point in the encounter, when Jesus meets Thomas right where he's at in his need, that doubt turns into something like understanding and awareness and belief. And Thomas cries, "My Lord, my God." Mary Magdalene mistook Jesus for a gardener until she heard Jesus say her name. The disciples locked themselves in a house until they saw Jesus standing before them. And Thomas doubted until he could touch Jesus. They each had experienced the presence of Jesus in a different way, a unique way, an experience that helped them recognize Jesus and believe. It's easy, and it's very often done, to hold up these 3 resurrection encounters as cautionary tales. Mary, too blind to see the truth of Jesus right in front of her. The disciples, too paralyzed by fear to believe. And Thomas, well, poor Thomas has spent thousands of years since his last breath bearing the moniker Doubting Thomas. But what if the focus in this particular encounter between Jesus and Thomas isn't really Thomas? Or the moment Thomas says, unless I put my finger in the nails marks and my hand on his side, I will not believe. What if that's just Thomas being Thomas, the one God designed Thomas to be, someone who understands through experience? What if the focus, the crucial teaching moment, is when Jesus just shows up again, mind you. He already showed up once, and all the other disciples had already seen and believed, and Thomas is the remaining one, and Jesus shows up again and holds out his nail-marked hands. So Thomas, that one remaining lost, wandering sheep disciple, will have a chance to understand and believe too. What if all these stories aren't cautionary tales against blindness and fear and doubt? Rather, one last story about how God revealed in Jesus meets us where we're at, shows up with us in unique ways that we are designed and created, giving us hope that the blind will see, that the fearful will have courage, that the doubters and skeptics will believe. What if these stories aren't rebukes against the Marys, the hidden away disciples, the Thomases in us? Rather, they are examples of the God of the universe who put on flesh, experienced life, submitted to death, and then also used those final earthly days to speak Mary's name so she could hear and believe, to show up in the midst of fear-blinded disciples so they could see and believe, and to show up again to extend nail-marked hands towards Thomas so he could touch and believe. What if? Through the lens of these alternate questions, the resurrection encounters with Jesus in John chapter 20 are, first, their assurances to us that even now, God shows up in our blindness and our deafness and our fear and our doubt and our skepticism and our grief and more to plant seeds of faith. And second, they're our call to do the same as those who follow in the example of Jesus, to show up with others wherever they are at. Recall the story again for a moment. Thomas spent a week with these fired up witnesses to the risen Jesus. He spent a week listening to their testimony, their eyewitness evidence, their persistent pleas for belief. A week surrounded by these fervent apologists, yet all their talking, persistence, and coercion didn't nudge doubt to belief or confusion to understanding, because Thomas was designed for something else to touch. Then Jesus showed up. And maybe we want to say that Thomas believed when he saw Jesus. That's that irrefutable proof of life in the vision of him, but that's not what the story says. Thomas didn't believe just because he saw Jesus. He believed when Jesus met him where he was at by extending his hand to be touched. I like the way that one author says it. The resurrection appearances were not concessions to human weakness. Rather, they were encounters that revealed the consistent character of God. For God, the very God who purposed human brains and bodies and designed the differences within them, showed up through Jesus in unique ways, persistent in pursuit of those on the margins of belief. Jesus didn't show up demanding immediate buy-in from people and then shun those who didn't fall in line. No, time and again, Jesus showed up so people could see or hear or touch and believe. A few weeks or months ago now, journalist and author David Brooks, a columnist, published a book called The Second Mountain. David Brooks, he grew up in a secular Jewish home, and he attended an Episcopal school. In his own words, he describes the experience this way. I grew up in the late 20th century American version of Judaism and the late 20th century version of Christianity. So I grew up either the most Christian-y Jew on the earth or the most Jewy Christian. A plight made survivable by the fact that I was certain God did not actually exist. As an adult, I went from a very clear non-believer to somebody who felt belief was good for other people, but it didn't really particularly impact me. And then to a growing awareness which felt more like recognizing something that was just inside me, that I actually do have belief. He continues, there was nothing super miraculous that led me to that discovery, and there are no dramatic moments. There was just gradual understanding. Some people have really fervent conversion experiences and fervent present awareness of God. That seems like a very genuine way to perceive God for them. It just doesn't happen to be mine. In this book, I wanted to make faith and the journey toward faith seem very ordinary. That book, The Second Mountain, he describes his journey toward belief in God and community with others. He's been promoting it. You've maybe even seen interviews on TV or read articles. This week, one in particular caught me as I was thinking about the ways in which Jesus shows up in these resurrection encounters. I invite you to listen to Peter Weiner's interview notes in The Atlantic after his interview with David Brooks. He writes, Brooks says that, like a lot of people, he had to overcome thousands of years of institutional religion to get where he is in belief. He told me he was less persuaded by people who were fervent believers than by the people who were periodic and doubting believers. And invoking the novelist and theologian Frederick Buechner, Brooks told me that faith is change. It's here one moment and gone the next. It's ups and downs. It's always movements. It's continued journey of exploration. Some of Brooks' critics have used his vulnerability against him because cynics will do what cynics do. For them, a person who decides to bring readers along on a translucent journey toward a more meaningful life, even one that is at times self-critical, is committing an unforgivable sin. So transparency doesn't go over too well with everyone, especially when it is twinned to an authentic exploration of faith, including one that is unfolding and doesn't fit into neat and tidy categories. Certain Orthodox Christians will be uneasy that Brooks voices doubt and is uncertain about the physical resurrection of Jesus. Certain people of the Jewish faith will be hurt because they believe he is leaving the Jewish fold. They all, each of them, want Brooks to be more like them, to see the world just as they do. But Brooks will continue to politely decline, for he has his own story to tell and his own experiences to share. So what if? What if all of these stories aren't cautionary tales against blindness, fear, and doubt? Rather, one last story about how God, revealed in Jesus, meets us where we are at, shows up in unique ways that we are designed and created, and gives us hope that the blind will see, the fearful will have courage, and the doubters and the skeptics will believe. And all God's people said, amen. Please pray with me. We praise you, God, creator of all that is and was and is to come, creator of us uniquely made and designed. In Jesus, you appeared to Mary Magdalene when she was weeping. You spoke her name, offered her comfort, called forth in your mission. This morning, we ask to comfort, like you did, Mary, those who are sad, lonely, grieving. Then in Jesus, you said to fearful disciples locked in a room long ago, peace, peace be with you. Bring your peace today, O God, into the world. The place is torn by division, fighting, anger. Show up in the ways most needed to bring about that peace. Then in Jesus, you showed up for Thomas. You extended your hands to him. You met him in the midst of his doubt and his confusion and his skepticism. Reassure those who are troubled by doubts. Journey alongside those who find themselves confused and perplexed. Be with those in the midst of skepticism and questions. Give them a sense of your presence this morning and throughout the week in just the way they need. And God, use us, your people. Use us to offer comfort to those who are grieving, Use us to bring about peace in the world. Use us to journey alongside those who are questioning and confused and doubting. May we do what you have given us the example of in Jesus. This morning, oh God, we thank you. We thank you for the way that you love us, that you've created us, and that you meet us in the midst of our created being. Break in once again through your resurrection and these resurrection encounters, and help us to live out the prayer that Jesus taught us to pray and that we pray this morning. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as in heaven.
Give us today our daily bread. Forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us. Save us from the time of trial, and deliver us from evil. For the kingdom, the power, and the glory are yours, now and forever.
Amen.